Drafting Archetypes is brought to you by Game Grid Lehigh. Game Grid Lehigh is an amazing place to buy and sell Magic the Gathering singles. Whether you're building a new cube or crafting your new constructed deck, Game Grid Lehigh is the place to do it. Got a draft coming up with some friends? Buy some seal product here and get it quick. So click the referral link in the description to help out the show, and don't forget to use the code DRAFTPRO10 to get 10% off on your next order at gglehigh.com.
Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be talking about white-black in Dominaria United. As always, the notes that I've taken for this episode are available patreon.com/draftingarchetypes if you want to follow along. Let's get into it. So we being this podcast / me, I guess, I've been following kind of this trend where the episodes have sort of like walked through my progression and evolution of priorities when I'm drafting. And white-black isn't like the next big thing. Like, I don't necessarily think that I'm like getting into a white-black phase where I'm going to draft white-black a lot. But I think that white-black is an important option to understand and be aware of if you've been kind of in a similar space to me with similar priorities. Specifically, the way that I'm currently approaching the format is very much to start in the Esper space. And the reason for that is that I think blue is probably the strongest color, and black plays really well with blue, and I like a lot of the black cards also. And then Destroy Evil specifically, I think, is the most underrated common by a lot. And I basically want to be able to take advantage of almost every Destroy Evil I see, and I have to expect to be white to do that. And because it's so splashable, I kind of want to always be positioned to pick up the value that's available from getting late Destroy Evils. If I'm kind of like in this Esper mindset, one of the things that's really good for me to be able to account for is what happens when blue is cut. Because I think blue kind of seems to be the most popular and contested, and while I'm not super aware of kind of like the larger consensus in the community, I think that there's kind of a big perception that blue is a desirable color to be in, if not the strongest color. And it might be perceived as the strongest color. When you kind of start out somewhere in Esper and blue is not available, sliding into just a smooth two-color white-black deck is a good place to be. I also think that white-black is a good kind of like default to slide into in any draft where the lands are really highly contested and you're better off being in two colors. I think there's a lot of like power and synergy in white-black. It gives you access to like good removal and reasonable card advantage and synergies and stuff like that. I think white-black is an important tool to have at your disposal. White-black has kind of a lot of inherent synergy. There are a lot of cards that like make tokens, cards that pump your team, cards that reward you for having a lot of creatures in play, cards that let you like sacrifice creatures for value, cards that give you triggers when creatures die. One way or another, a large creature count coming into existence and then something happening with them. Either they attack for damage, or they block, or they get sacrificed, or whatever. Black-white is good at doing things in that space. The important thing to understand and unpack there is that you can do a lot of different things in this space. And there are a lot of sets of cards that have overlapping synergies where like card A is good with card B and card C is good with one of them but not the other, or like they're all good if you're pairing it with D but not if you're pairing it with E. And what I mean is basically that there are kind of competing philosophies in terms of the large game, small game. Do I want objects in play, or do I want like objects to die / get out of play / whatever? Like, and basically, where do I exist on the tempo to attrition spectrum? I don't talk about it all that often, I think, but I've talked about it a few times in the past that I think tempo and attrition are opposite ends of a spectrum. You can't really be both of them. Tempo is about making the game about the amount of time that exists, the amount of mana that people are bottlenecked on, like creating, number of attack steps, number of turns, number of draws, number of untapped lands, amount of total mana, constraining some axis, some resource like that, making the game about that axis. Whereas attrition is about running the opponent out of cards, or depleting some kind of resource, such that it's not time, it's about objects. And some decks are called mid-range, and they can kind of play either game. Generally, decks that are called aggro decks are more likely to be on the tempo end. Decks that are called control are more likely to be on the attrition end, but that doesn't really cover all the cases, and it's not exactly that simple. In Dominaria, each color kind of has a thing that it's about. They're kind of best exemplified by the common cost reduction cycle of creatures. Tolarian Terror tells you that blue is about instants and sorceries. Phalanx tells you that white is about having a lot of creatures in play. Necromass tells you that black is about the graveyard, etc. And so when you're drafting white-black, the question is, are you about what white's about, which is having a lot of creatures in play, which is playing a large game, which is more likely to be a tempo game? Or are you about what black is about, which is having creatures in the graveyard, which is more about playing a small game, which is more likely to be an attrition game? And that kind of informs, when you make a token, are you trying to hold on to that token, attack with that token, use it as part of maybe a heroic charge kind of attack, or use it to play Argivian Phalanx, pump your team with maybe the 3-mana 3/2 that can pump your team, or any sort of similar effect? Or are you about, well, now I have this token, that means that I get to draw an extra card with my Gibbering Barricade, that means that I'm going to draw into more tokens? Either of those plans works, but you're going to have the most synergistic, powerful deck if you know what you're about. You obviously, there are a lot of cards that straddle this line. Argivian Cavalier is well, I have 2 bodies, I have an actual creature card. If this trades off, it powers my Necromass. If it stays in play, it powers my Phalanx. And if your whole deck is just creatures that make creatures, and either of the big things and whatever, you can exist in kind of the mid-range space where you adapt to the game that you're playing. But if you're really dedicated to one plan or the other, there are, I guess, some benefits for specialization. And we can see some of that even in the data on 17 lands. One of the things that really stood out to me is that Argivian Phalanx doesn't have impressive stats overall, but it has really, really good stats among top players. And I think that that's just a matter of only some decks want to play Argivian Phalanx. Top players are putting it in the decks that are really taking advantage of it, whereas players as a whole are just, playing it with, well, I'm a white and black deck with some creatures, I'm sure this will be fine. Incidentally, I noticed also another card that kind of spiked among top players was Battlefly Swarm, the 1-mana 1/1 flyer that you can get Death Touch for a black. I suspect that having the common playable 1-mana creature, which is in short supply in this set, plays really well with Argivian Phalanx. It's a way to accelerate that down. Getting a 1-mana sheep creature in play makes it a lot easier that a lot more likely that you're gonna get the Phalanx down in a way that's meaningfully tempo positive. And then there's other stuff like Captain's Call is good in some like white black decks and bad in others. Like, and it's not even just Captain's Call is good if you're specifically trying to like play the white side of things and go wide. It might be good in like the black attrition decks if you're like, well, this is 3 different objects that I can sack to my Gibbering Barricade. That's going to be a lot of blockers, a lot of card advantage. But if you're like, well, I have 3 Necromasses, then you probably don't want Captain's Call to exist in like a creature slot that doesn't put a creature card in your deck, especially if you also have Eerie Soul Tender, where a lot of the cards in your deck are getting milled, and if you mill that, it really hurts you that you didn't mill a creature. So you need to really pay attention to the exact synergies between your cards, and there's not like a clear right answer for white-black. It's not like these are the good cards, these are the bad cards, or you're supposed to be this plan, you're supposed to be that plan. There are times when there are sets that try to seed 2 different approaches to a color combination in. This happens a lot in like the guild sets, where because like the Ravnica sets, where because they focus on maybe 3 or 4 different color combinations and they need to support an entire limited environment where there are only like 3 or 4 decks, they need to make sure that there's like an aggro and control build for each of them. And sometimes one of those is fake. Like the cards are just much worse in that color combination if you're trying to play a slow game than a fast game, so you play the fast game. Here, for whatever reason, I think that they really succeeded at creating this space where you can focus on kind of any aspect of what these things might be doing, and it works well. And you can also focus on, oh, I'm just going to play the versatile cards. I'm just going to play Argivian Cavalier and Phyrexian Rager, and like as long as I have that kind of thing, my Phalanx and my Necromass are both going to be playable. I might have like a little bit of each of those, and I'm not going to have the really dedicated stuff like Captain's Call and Eerie Soul Tender and Gibbering Barricade. Like, when you're really focused, you can play Heroic Charge, arguably. Note, Heroic Charge has concerningly bad stats in white-black. I think you need to be extremely dedicated to the white side to consider playing it. And like, if your deck has both a Heroic Charge and a Gibbering Barricade in it, there's probably something wrong here, right? Like those cards, there's a lot of tension between like a Trumpet Blast and a wall that wants you to like have fewer, like that gets rid of your creatures to do something productive. So as far as like navigating which of these decks you're supposed to be, when, and why, some of it, I think, genuinely for a lot of players is going to come down to your play style, both in terms of like which kinds of things you're going to be drawn to in picks where it's similar, but also just literally how you're going to play the game. There are players who are more inclined or less inclined to trade, more or less inclined to pay attention to pressuring the opponent's life total versus like naturally focusing on card advantage. And the different decks that you can have in this space are going to naturally play to like some of those tendencies and not others. So this is an archetype or a set of archetypes where knowing yourself as a player and kind of following your natural tendencies and inclinations is probably going to be a good idea and going to like help you end up in somewhere that's going to be successful for you. But also you can often let the uncommons that there are a lot of really powerful white and black uncommons, and some, but not all of them, clearly point in one direction more than the other direction. They're powerful enough that they can go anywhere, but for example, the knights, Knight of Dawns and Dusks, whatever, the pump knights with a keyword and some life-related ability are very good aggressive cards. They're going to be good in any deck, but they're really good at getting persistent damage in starting early. They're both difficult to block. And Phyrexian Missionary is, like you're happy to have a 2/3 lifelink creature in an aggro deck, but you get the most value out of it if you kick it and do the recursion thing, and it's kind of more naturally suited to more of an attrition deck. So if you start, like, if the reason that you got into white-black is a knight, you're more likely to want to bias toward an aggressive deck, whereas if the reason you got into white-black is a Phyrexian Missionary, you're more likely to want to bias toward an attritive deck. Cult Conscript is kind of good either way, depending on how you're trying to use it. It's a 2/1 that gives you a slightly more persistent body. If you're aggressive, it's kind of like a value sack engine if you're attrition. Ellis, I think, similar situation where it's just kind of really good no matter what you're doing. Resolute Reinforcements, very much more on the white side. Though, again, there's play there in the black direction. If you have like Bone Splinters and stuff, Resolute Reinforcements is a good way to enable it. Bone Splinters is another good example of something that like uses a token well, but Bone Splinters makes a lot more sense in a deck with Necromass than it does in a deck with Argivian Phalanx. I don't have like a clear, you should be this one. That's really my main point, is this is tough to navigate, very wobbly, but this is what you should be thinking about when you're drafting white-black, is figuring out kind of your lane and strategy and your spot in the like aggro to control, tempo to attrition spectrum, which is really just about understanding your deck and its game plan. And obviously that can morph throughout the draft. A lot of the cards, a lot of the time you're just going to be taking the best white or black card you see. And the same way that like an early uncommon that pulls in one direction or another can bias you toward its direction, the same thing can happen later, especially if you get like a powerful rare. I'd say a powerful rare that pulls in one direction or another. Realistically, the way that limited works, powerful rares just kind of naturally pull you a little bit more controlling, because the longer the game is, the more likely you are to draw that bomb. And also, especially when we're in this space where the attrition version has more like graveyard recursion, if you have a bomb, that graveyard recursion gets a lot better, right? So you could be drafting like the, Phalanx white aggressive version, and then if you get especially Shieldred, but also like Archangel of Wrath or something, you can say, oh, well, now I want to slow this down. I want to make sure the game goes long enough that I can draw this. I want to prioritize Eerie Soul Tenders to find it and let me cast it again. And it's going to be very easy, even like first pick pack 3, to kind of like morph your deck's game plan to build around that rare that you found. Whereas, if in pack 2 you open a less strong rare like the Soldier Lord, that push you to want to be more aggressive. It likes it if you have a lot of soldiers in play. It makes them bigger, better to attack with. Even if you haven't drawn it yet, it's good to like, you're more likely to want to just like not trade off your tokens, because you'll get more value if you get to pump them first if you draw that Lord. Pay attention to both having an idea about where what your deck's plan is, but also figuring out if that should change over the course of the draft. And you want to, be flexible. And there really are a lot of cards that are just, generically functional that are going to work in any version of this. Notably, especially removal, but also, like I talked about, just kind of the like solid 2-drops like Argivian Cavalier, or 3-drops like Argivian Cavalier and Phyrexian Rager. And Benelish Sleeper is a little bit more on the black side, since it has that make the game smaller kicker. But the white deck can also just be happy to play a 3/1 for 2 as an aggressive creature and not really plan to kick it. Oh, as always, side note, disclaimer, or whatever, if you have Wingmantle Chaplain, this is a white deck. It's a white deck that can play Barricade. If you have Chaplain, you look for Shield Wall Sentinels. And obviously, you can be a white-black defender deck if that happens. Nothing wrong with that. It totally fits the like go wide plan in a variety of ways. If you have a Chaplain, see everything else I've said about like defenders, morph into taking full advantage of the Chaplain in every way that you can. It can overlap with other stuff that's going on in white-black. If you pivot late and keep most of whatever you were doing, that's fine. I feel like, I don't know, frustrated that it seems like I couldn't get quite as detailed as I would like, because like this feels like it's been kind of very abstract in terms of like, oh, find a lane and figure it out, but I'm not really sure how to get quite more detailed than I have. So I'm going to turn this over to chat. If chat can help me kind of like drill into that, that would be great. Also, as always, happy to answer any other questions anyone has. As usual, if you've said anything before, if it's still an open question that you have, be sure to put it into chat again. While I'm letting people think of and ask those questions, I want to thank the newest patrons of the podcast, Stav, Marius, John, and Avid Moondicer. Thank you very much for the support. If anyone else listening is interested in supporting the program, getting access to notes, weighing in on what I talk about in future episodes, I'm actually going to switch from here to putting up weekly polls about what I'll be covering next. I feel comfortable enough with the format as a whole that I can do that. Also, discounts for coaching and some other perks. Be sure to check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes to see what we offer there. So first question, my big question for White Black is, can it be successful without Ellis and or Aaron? Yeah, I mean, so the easy answer is, well, you could always just have Wingmantle Chaplain instead. But, I mean, similarly, you could just have Shieldred, and it's better than either of those would be. I would note also that, like, Aaron doesn't have very good stats, and while I have seen it do good work in White-Black, like, once or twice ever, I don't think it's really, like, a core component. So, I mean, I don't know. The question is, like, hard for me to really take seriously. There are a lot of powerful cards in Limited. There are no decks outside of like Defenders needing Chaplain that really rely on a single card, because you could just have a different card that's comparably strong. How highly do you value taking Black Defenders if you aren't in a dedicated Defender deck but are more White-Black mid-range? So I guess I want to unpack the idea of mid-range there. If by mid-range you mean genuinely in the middle of where White and Black might be, and you're kind of trying to play a flexible game that can take advantage of like any of these cards, I wouldn't prioritize it very highly. If what you mean is control, but you don't like assigning the concept control to a deck without blue, then I think that you can end up in some of the like more attrition-based strategies that value Gibbering Barricade pretty highly, even if they're not like doing the defender thing. And that would just be about, you know, if you're really prioritizing, like, I have some token making that I'm using to draw cards and I'm playing a bunch of removal and I'm like waiting until I find some kind of bomb, then like Barricade can be pretty good in like the dedicated control version of White-Black. Can you give your thoughts on Citizen's Arrest / Binding? Yeah, I think that the only real like punish for them as removal is Destroy Evil. Destroy Evil is underplayed despite being like arguably the best common, I think pretty clearly the best common removal spell in the set, and has lots of other good targets. It's like a 1-for-1, not a 2-for-1 when it kills something unless it's ambushing you in combat. They're functional removal spells. And this is nothing like a pacifism kind of situation where your opponent can free their creature with an unsummon or a flicker, or it like fails to deal with the static text or activated abilities. Like, they actually remove the creature. Oblivion Ring is generally a strong removal spell in Limited, where Pacifism is a weak removal spell in Limited. This is a format with a particularly high amount of recursion, which makes exiling rather than destroying creatures particularly valuable. Citizen's Arrest suffers from being a sorcery, which is often a problem with those. Binding doesn't suffer from that. So I think Binding is excellent. Citizen's Arrest, its biggest drawback outside of being a sorcery is costing double white, which honestly makes it really appealing for this deck because it goes later and you can cast it pretty easily. I think Citizen's Arrest is a significant draw to this like archetype broadly, being able to like actually use this like hard removal that goes kind of late. It's reasonably efficient because you can play the double white casting cost that a lot of other people can't, is a nice draw to this. So I think that those are cards that you should be watching for and generally playing, but you don't need to take Citizen's Arrest in particular very highly. How good is the white-white-black uncommon? That's Aaron. That's the 3/3 that you can spend a white and a black and sack a creature to tap it and sacrifice a creature to put +1/+1 counters on all your creatures. I assume it's more of a black card than a white one. No, so I mean, it's not very good, and it's more of a white card than a black card. The reason is that while it does sacrifice a creature, which makes it look like a black card, the more important thing about it is that it needs a large game rather than a small game. Because it's only worth sacrificing the creature if you're getting a lot of counters out of it, and you're only getting a lot of like counters equal to the number of creatures you have. It's bad on a small board. Like if you have it and one other creature, it's not very good, whereas it's good on a wide board. If you have 10 creatures, it's awesome. And so that's how you know it's very much more a white card than a black card, outside of just looking at its casting cost as a cheat there. How does the wall theme and the fact that it's quite powerful affect the complexity of how best to play white-black? I assume when you say play, you mean draft, because by the time you're actually playing the games, you kind of know if you're a wall deck or not, and the complexity isn't really there. You do the thing that the deck that you drafted does. As far as drafting it, I think, when there's not a card for you, you should take speculative Shield Wall Sentinels as always, especially when you're in white. But for the most part, you should just ignore the fact that they exist until you see a chaplain. And so I don't think it really makes things that much more complicated. If it's early and you are like positioned well and you're seeing walls table in a way that indicates that no one has a Shield Wall Sentinel yet, and you're thinking, all right, or no one has a chaplain yet, rather, and you're thinking, all right, if a chaplain gets open next to me, it might get past me. There's like a better than normal chance that I'll end up with chaplain and defenders. Maybe you want to like prioritize like a removal spell a little bit more highly than you normally would. Like maybe you'll take a Citizen's Arrest over a Phyrexian Rager or something, where you would have gone the other way if you weren't like trying to be open to defenders. For the most part, I think you should just not really think about the defender thing until you have a chaplain. What are your thoughts about the amount of lands to take in different archetypes? I feel like my flood has been excessive, even with 17 lands. I think that most versions of this deck, like I think that there are a lot of 3-drops that are pretty desirable. And there are also so few ones that I think it's hard to have a deck that's like happy to operate on 2 mana for very long. So I think you need to be careful about going much below 17. And I think, you can go lower if you have like a lot of Ragers and like kind of a lower curve. But yeah, I think for the most part, this is going to be a 17 land deck. And I would look to have, just like a little bit more up the curve, more mana sinks, Eerie Soul Tender, Phyrexian Warhorse type cards to deal with flooding, rather than feeling comfortable cutting lands most of the time. If you do happen to have like a lot of, 1s and 2s somehow, you can go lower, but it's dicey off the top of my head with kind of the cards that I think are most likely to end up here. What role do you think Take Up the Shield and Battle Rage Blessing play in either variant? I think because you don't really have trample in this color combination, that Battle Rage Blessing isn't at its best. The most likely exception I can think of to that is if you had multiple of the Black Knights that have Menace, because Battle Rage is very good when you're double blocked. But for the most part, I would expect to be more interested in Take Up the Shield than Battle Rage Blessing. And I think Take Up the Shield has a lot of potential, especially with Phalanx and Necromass, either one. Notably, I think a common situation that's going to come up is the Phalanx v Tolarian Terror matchup, where Take Up the Shield will work very well at letting your Phalanx take down a Tolarian Terror that would otherwise like dominate your board. So I think that like Take Up the Shield is a reasonable tool. It's better in the more white leaning, more aggressive versions, especially if you're lower on removal, since you're more likely to need the trick to get through, and more likely to have enough creatures that you're happy to have a card that requires a creature in combat to be functional, or in play in the case of just using it to counter a removal spell. How much weight do you give recursion overall for both? A lot more weight if I'm more in the black space than the white space, and in general weight proportionate to my strongest cards. Noting again that strongest literally means high impact more than it means good, because like recurring efficient 2-mana creatures is not as strong as recurring, like a high impact card like Necromass. Even though the efficient 2-mana creature like a knight might be a much stronger card, it's weaker in the late game, so it's less powerful to recur. If you manage to be in the mid-range space and can flex in-game between tempo and attrition, how do you decide what your game plan will be for each game? How should your play change for each plan? In general, you would want to focus on tempo when you're the beatdown and attrition when you're the control. If you think that your opponent is trying to go under you, you're happier to trade and avoid taking damage and try to grind them out. If your opponent is trying to go over you, has a strong late game, you're more likely to need to kill them before that happens and to want to focus on going under them. Just kind of like be the opposite of what your opponent is being rather than being a bad version of what your opponent is when you're in the flex space is my best answer to how do you decide what your plan will be when you're more kind of flexible and in the middle. Good question, by the way. I really like opportunities to speak to gameplay, and I think that that's one that's pretty, clear and useful. Is there a place for the green-white queen in the big game version? Possibly. Yes. I mean, if you have a bunch of token making and your strategy involves keeping your creatures in play, she's going to be like large and synergistic and help make more things. That's a reasonable card to splash. Oh, that was actually a thing that I have some notes on that I forgot to talk about, is just this archetype can, of course, splash and pivot into various 3-color decks. Mardu is more likely to be aggressive and about tokens in general. Abzan is more likely to be about graveyard and recursion, but it doesn't have to be that way. The Green-White Queen is an example of a card that would push it the other way. And there are ways to be in kind of like a red-black base Mardu space that's more attrition-y. But I think that the tendencies are the way that I said. This is obviously a format with enough dual lands that kind of anything can splash. Obviously, typical rules apply. Splashing is harder the more aggressive you are, easier the longer the game you're planning to play is. How do the aggressive white-black decks close the game if the opponent starts to stabilize and heroic charge is bad? Phyrexian Warhorse can break through sometimes. One of the better answers is just like have some removal spells. Sometimes you're going to be in a spot where you have a bunch of stuff in play. Your opponent has like a big thing that's holding it off. If you draw your Destroy Evil or Citizen's Arrest or Extinguish, you can kill the thing and make a big attack. Combat tricks can also work here. Sometimes you're going to be in a spot where your creatures are too small for Take Up the Shield to give you a good attack, but sometimes you won't be. It's awkward that there's not really... so Battle Rage Blessing, I guess, in addition to shining with Tramplers, also shines in a spot where you're like, well, I have a lot of 1/1s and 2/2s, and my opponent might have a 4/4, and Take Up the Shield won't let me attack, but Battle Rage Blessing will like function as kind of a weak removal spell to let me attack. Still not what I would consider my like go-to strategy there. The other answer, of course, is evasion. If you have, if you can prioritize getting some flyers. I don't like most of them very much, unfortunately, in white-black. A lot of the flying commons just happen to have a pretty bad rate, sadly. But yeah, I think, I think the default case that you're hoping for is removal to stop your opponent from stabilizing. Would you play Repossession without a green splash, or is it worth splashing green just for that? Really depends on how good the things you have to recur are and how good you are at getting them into your graveyard. So like if I have, Shieldred and Eerie Soul Tender, then maybe I'll play Repossession. But if I'm just getting commons back with it, then I would probably rather just play another common that I can cast without needing to like get back a thing. Is there a particular card/color you're actively looking to splash in this archetype? Probably asked before I went back and spoke to that. Can go wherever. Bone Rattle is a good splash in any kind of like black recursion-y type deck. If you're in kind of the like wide aggressive space, you can splash the Strike Team, the 3/1 that makes the 2/1/1s when you kick it, or like the red kicker on Heroic Charge, or any of that stuff, or just lightning strikes. Do you value bone splinters, particularly in go wide / sack fodder decks, or in what situations do you value bone splinters more than usual? Bone splinters is much better when you're thinking of yourself as more of the like black deck than the white deck. It's a card that leads to small games, is a good way to like use token, like to get an efficient hard removal spell if you can make tokens, or other things that you're happy to sacrifice, like Eerie Soul Tender. But if I'm in kind of like the aggressive go wide space, I would prefer to have something that doesn't work against my game plan as my removal spell. Focus on Citizen's Rest and stuff instead. If you're erring toward the black side of things, is being on the draw ever a consideration? Being on the draw for me these days is never a consideration in any deck because I don't get the option, so I don't think about it because I'm playing best of one. But yes, if you are playing a game where you get to decide if you're on the play or the draw, any sort of attrition deck is when I'm starting to think about what being on the draw. You're going to want to have cheap, efficient removal, cut down. Destroy Evil fits a little bit less here because it's not going to help you against like small aggressive creatures getting in early. But if you're a low curve attrition deck in particular, such that you're not worried about getting run over and you know that you're going to be able to like make the game about card quantity pretty early, then choosing draw is very reasonable. Does this deck have issues with flyers? Save from blue-red, both the common and uncommon flyers don't seem too impressive. Yeah, sadly I did mention that the flyers in white-black are mostly pretty bad. Battlefly Swarm is almost the most notable exception, which is not great, but is a good answer to flyers if you're worried about your opponent attacking you with flyers. I think like by nature of being a two-color deck in this format, and therefore like having untapped lands and then kind of like a slightly lower curve to go along with that, you're going to be like getting under people a lot in a way that, you're not necessarily that worried about flyers because they're like, if they're using flyers to block your non-flyers and then they trade, obviously it doesn't matter that they had flying. Of course, against a deck like blue-red, you're not, necessarily getting under them the same way. And I would say that those are the matchups where Take Up the Shield really shines. A lot of the time, what you're going to have to do against flyers, if you don't have removal for them, is to just race. And Take Up the Shield can swing the race in your favor in a pretty big way, in a way that can then force your opponent to like block with their flyers and trade them with your attackers, rather than ignoring your attackers and winning in the air. So I would say, like, yes, your inability to block flyers is going to be a thing that's happening and something to keep in mind, and is one of the bigger reasons to play Take Up the Shield. And that's kind of your sneaky answer to flyers. In black-white, do you ever not take enchantment-based removal because of Destroy Evil? No, is basically the answer to that question. I guess I still feel like Destroy Evil is somewhat underplayed, which I don't know if that's true. One of the stats that I would like, I mentioned this on stream, I think, in the last week, and wanted to follow up suggesting this to someone at 17 Lands. I know I have some listeners there. Suggestion that would be great to add to 17 Lands data is how often a card ends up in a main deck versus a sideboard when it's drafted. It would be really cool to be able to see what percent of Destroy Evils people end up playing. And then you could see like, oh, how much should I be biasing my deck around this existing in people's decks? I guess you can kind of look at that with number of games played, but it's not quite the same. For the most part, I figure Destroy Evil is going to have a target regardless. Doesn't really matter. Play your removal. It's just a 1-for-1 if they answer it. But I think that black-white can be in a space where you have nothing that gets hit by Destroy Evil. So like if you don't have an Argivian Phalanx or a Necromass or a Barricade in your deck, then it's more reasonable to think, oh wait, maybe I also shouldn't play any enchantment-based removal so that my opponent's Destroy Evils can be dead. Because if I play exactly one thing that it hits, now I'm like turning their card on in a way that's going to get me blown out. I think that that's something that I would think about a lot more in sideboarding than like in best of one, or in building a main deck. But I do think I could imagine a spot where I would consider not playing an enchantment-based removal because of Destroy Evil, if and only if I literally had no creatures to destroy evil could hit. Once I'm in a space where destroy evil is going to be good against me one way or another, then I don't see it as a reason to avoid playing enchantment-based removal. I think that's going to finish us off. Thank you, as always, for listening. Thanks especially to people in chat giving me some questions to help round this out and make sure I didn't forget anything or forgot less than I otherwise would have to cover. As I mentioned earlier, next week I will be discussing an archetype as voted on by the patrons at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. And I'll be back then. Bye, everyone.